I always thought the walls of a marriage were solid until I heard a crack in mine. Last Thursday evening, I came home earlier than usual. The rain was pouring in sheets, the kind that made the whole neighborhood feel drenched in shadows. My plan was to grab some hot takeout and surprise Sarah, maybe even have a rare quiet night in. I was juggling a steaming bag of curry and naan when I noticed the faint sound of music coming from our basement. The basement. Sarah and I hardly ever used it. It was where we threw the old furniture we couldn't be bothered to throw out, or where I'd stash my tools and random junk. But tonight, there was music, a low, sensual beat I didn't recognize, seeping up through the floorboards. I set the food on the counter and headed downstairs, confused. I didn't expect anything too weird. Maybe she was cleaning up, or she decided to start using the basement as her little reading nook. But as I crept down the stairs, what I heard next made me freeze halfway down. Her laughter. But it wasn't just any laughter. It was that throaty, giddy kind that I hadn't heard from her in years. It sounded private, intimate, like the kind of laugh you can't fake. And then, beneath her laughter, a man's voice, low, murmuring something I couldn't make out. My chest tightened, and I felt the sting of something sharp and icy twist inside me. I'd heard Sarah's laugh thousands of times, sure, but this wasn't meant for me. I stayed frozen on those stairs, one hand gripping the banister, listening. I could hear her voice as clear as day, mixed with that man's voice I couldn't quite place. They were close, just beneath me, hidden behind the basement door. I thought about busting in, maybe slamming the door open, but I held back. I needed to see, not just hear. I felt like I was outside my own life, watching this scene from somewhere else. My mind tried to reason it away, maybe it was innocent, maybe it was a mistake. But everything in my gut told me otherwise. I crept back up the stairs, grabbed my phone, and then quietly opened the basement door, peering around the corner. I couldn't see them, but I could see their shadows shifting along the wall in the dim light. My heart hammered as I stepped inside. I'd never felt a mix of anger and dread like that before. Slowly, I rounded the corner and finally saw them, Sarah, sitting on the old couch we'd shoved down there when we redecorated, leaning way too close to a guy I recognized immediately, our new neighbor, Josh. He was grinning, and she was looking at him with that familiar spark I thought was only for me. And right then, they kissed. There it was, plain as day. I didn't yell. I didn't stomp over and demand an answer. I just stared, too numb to react. They broke apart, Sarah brushing her hair behind her ear, smiling, and Josh said something that made her laugh again. That laughter, it might as well have been a punch in the gut. That was mine, she was mine, and now I was watching her give herself away like I didn't exist. I realized I was gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. So, I did the only thing I could think of, I recorded it. Just a quick, shaky video. I didn't care about framing or sound, I just needed proof that this wasn't some twisted nightmare I'd wake up from. When I hit stop, I shoved the phone into my pocket and backed up toward the stairs, leaving them to their little secret. They didn't even notice me, too wrapped up in each other to feel the weight of what they'd done. I slipped back upstairs, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I drove aimlessly, no destination in mind, my head spinning with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? How many times had they used our home, our basement, like it was their private little hideaway? I couldn't process it. I felt betrayed, humiliated, like someone had ripped my life out from under me without warning. After an hour of driving, I ended up in the empty lot behind my office building. I parked, rested my head on the steering wheel, and let the reality of it sink in. My wife, my partner of 7 years, the mother of our kids, had thrown everything away for what? A quick thrill? The rush of breaking rules? I sat there for what felt like hours, wrestling with my emotions, trying to understand how I'd ended up here, alone in a parking lot with nothing but a sick feeling in my gut. I went home later that night. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without a plan. So, I just slipped into bed next to her, pretending nothing was wrong. She was already asleep, oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. Lying there, watching her breathe like she hadn't just torn our family apart, I felt something shift inside me, a cold, simmering anger that burned away any love I'd felt for her. I knew what I had to do, and it started with making her feel every ounce of betrayal she'd dealt me. The next morning, I played it cool. I waited until she left to take the kids to school and then started gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I went through her phone records, checked our shared computer for any trace of hidden messages, and even dug through her things in the closet. I found notes, messages, receipts, clear signs that this thing with Josh wasn't some one-time mistake. She'd been hiding it right under my nose, assuming I'd never look close enough to notice. By the time she came home, I'd pieced together more than I ever wanted to know. When Sarah walked through the door that night, everything looked normal. She set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and gave me the same smile she always did. But it wasn't the same to me. I could barely look at her without feeling disgusted. The urge to confront her then and there was almost overwhelming, but I needed her to feel it, to understand exactly how far she'd gone and just what she'd destroyed. We had dinner, talking about trivial things while I sat there, barely tasting the food. I watched her, noting every little detail, seeing her like I'd never seen her before. Her laughter, her expressions, it all felt like a lie, like I was sharing a table with a stranger. Finally, after we put the kids to bed, I sat her down in the living room. I didn't say a word at first, just looking at her until she noticed something was off. Her smile faded, and a cautious look crossed her face. "What's wrong?" she asked. I didn't bother with small talk. "How long have you been seeing him?" Her face went pale, like I'd slapped her. She looked at me, wide-eyed, her mouth half open in shock. For a second, I thought she'd try to deny it, maybe even laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But then she closed her mouth, took a deep breath, and looked down at the floor. "Jake." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered. I took out my phone, opened the video, and held it in front of her. I watched her face as she saw it, the moment she recognized herself, saw Josh, the kiss. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she jerked back like I'd slapped her. "Oh my God. Jake, I can explain." "Explain?" I cut her off, barely holding back the anger that had been building inside me. "Explain what, Sarah? That you've been sneaking around with him right under my nose? In our own house?" She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading, but she didn't have a single excuse that made sense. "It's not what it looks like, Jake. I can explain. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words hit me like a joke, a pathetic attempt to downplay everything she'd done. I laughed, but it wasn't out of humor. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? You think I'm stupid? You think I can't tell when my wife's been lying to me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking completely cornered. But I wasn't done. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been meeting up with him while I've been sitting here, trusting you? While I've been watching our kids, making excuses for your late nights? Jake, please. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice low. "What's complicated about cheating on your husband with the guy who just moved in next door?" She looked like she wanted to disappear, her face crumbling as she tried to hold herself together. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, looking at me with those same eyes that used to mean something. But now, I couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. "Here's the thing, Sarah. I don't need you to explain. I don't need excuses. I need to know why you thought it was okay to ruin our family like this. Was it worth it? Was he worth it?" She broke down then, her face in her hands, crying in that way she did when she knew she'd messed up. But it didn't make me feel better, it just made me angrier. She looked up at me, her face red and blotchy, and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I know I've messed up, Jake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just lonely, okay? You've been so busy, so wrapped up in work, and I didn't know how to reach you. So it's my fault?" I shot back, feeling the anger flare up again. "You're blaming me for your affair? Because I was working to support our family?" She shook her head, wiping her face with her hands. No. That's not what I meant. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't plan any of this. Josh was. I don't know. It was a mistake, Jake. Just a stupid mistake. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep control. A mistake. You think this was a mistake? A mistake is forgetting to pick up the milk on the way home, Sarah. This isn't a mistake, it's a choice. You made a choice, over and over again, to sneak around and lie to me. She looked down, defeated, like she finally understood that her words couldn't fix this. Please, Jake. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes. I just don't want to lose you, or the kids. I'll go to counseling, Do you think I'm interested in your promises now? You think some therapy session is going to make this go away? She looked back up at me, desperate. Jake, I love you. I do. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to throw this all away. Her words hung in the air, empty and meaningless. They didn't carry the weight they once would have. I didn't feel reassured or loved, I felt insulted. She had already thrown everything away, and now she was trying to act like it was something we could patch up. I stood up, done with the conversation. You love me? You don't love me, Sarah. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have risked everything for a fling with some guy who's barely out of college. She tried to grab my hand, but I pulled away, feeling my patience snap. Don't touch me, I said coldly. You made your choice. Now, you have to live with it. She stayed on the couch, crying, pleading with me to reconsider, to forgive her. But there was nothing left to forgive. She'd killed any trust I'd had, and all the apologies in the world wouldn't bring it back. I told her I was done talking and walked upstairs, locking the bedroom door behind me. She knocked, called my name, begged me to come out, but I ignored her. I had nothing left to say. As I lay there in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I felt the weight of everything settle on me. She'd shattered our life, broken every promise, and for what? A cheap thrill? I couldn't wrap my head around it, couldn't understand how she'd let things get this far. And I knew that no matter what she said, no matter what promises she made, things would never be the same. It was over, and in the silence of that room, I made a decision. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. My mind was clear, focused, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. Sarah had taken something from me that I could never get back, and now, it was my turn. She'd betrayed me, humiliated me, and it was time for her to feel the consequences. She was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her face a mess from crying all night. She looked up at me, trying to gauge my mood, hoping for some sign that maybe things would be okay. I didn't give her one. I didn't say a word to her as I grabbed my own cup and went straight to the garage to get started. I had a lot of work to do, and I wasn't about to waste time. First, I moved all of her things out of our bedroom. Clothes, makeup, jewelry, everything that was hers was shoved into boxes and bags and dumped into the guest room down the hall. I wanted her out of my space, out of my sight. If she'd treated our marriage like some temporary arrangement, she could start living like a temporary guest in our house. She came upstairs while I was hauling her things out of the closet, and I could feel her watching me. Jake, please. We can talk about this. I'll do whatever it takes to fix things. I didn't stop. I barely even looked at her. You're moving into the guest room. This room is mine now. You don't get to be here anymore. Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I was done caring. She could feel as hurt and helpless as I did for all I cared. She didn't try to argue, and after a few seconds, she just left me to finish. When her things were finally cleared out, I locked the bedroom door behind me and set up a new lock. She wouldn't be coming in here again. But that was just the start. Over the next few days, I went through our accounts, our finances, every detail of our lives together. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, I'd be protected and she'd be left with as little as possible. I contacted a lawyer, laid out everything I had, photos, the video, even the messages I'd pulled from her phone. My lawyer didn't hold back, he told me exactly how to make the case airtight, how to ensure that I wouldn't lose more than necessary. I hired a private investigator to confirm the details, to dig into every detail of her and Josh's affair. If she wanted to throw our life away for him, I'd make sure she'd pay for it. While I worked on my own plans, I kept up appearances. I acted civil in front of the kids, keeping everything as normal as possible, though it killed me to pretend. Sarah tried to get me to talk, tried to plead with me, but I kept her at a distance. I answered her questions with short, curt replies. She'd already said everything that mattered to me the night I confronted her. I was only staying civil for the kids. Then, a week later, I dropped the first bomb. We were having dinner, the kids chattering about school and their plans for the weekend. Sarah was playing her part, smiling, trying to keep up with their stories. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down, looked at her, and said, "I know you've been seeing Josh." "I've known for weeks." She went pale, her eyes darting to the kids, who looked confused, then back to me. "Jake, not now, please," she whispered, but I didn't back down. "You should know that I'm moving forward with a divorce," I said, my voice calm. "You and Josh can continue whatever you want when it's official. But you won't be doing it as my wife." The kids looked at her, the confusion turning to a mix of shock and hurt. She tried to brush it off, telling them it was just grown-up stuff that we'd figure out, but I could see the cracks starting to show. They asked questions, they wanted answers, but I kept things simple. I wasn't about to sugarcoat this for her benefit. Over the next few days, I made sure she felt the reality of the situation. I called her parents, laid out everything, and let them know they could talk to her about the mess she'd created. I didn't hold back, not for a second. Her father called her the same night, demanding an explanation, and I could hear her stammering on the phone, trying to defend herself, trying to play down what she'd done. But I knew her parents wouldn't buy it. They'd always seen me as the stable, trustworthy one, and hearing the truth about their daughter shattered whatever ideal they had of her. And then, I went further. I called Josh's wife. I told her everything, sent her the video, the messages, everything I'd gathered. I wanted him to feel the fallout just as much as Sarah. If he thought he could destroy my family without consequences, he was wrong. His wife was furious, devastated. She thanked me, and I could hear the anger in her voice as she promised to deal with him. I could only imagine the fallout he'd face when he got home. Good. He deserved it. Sarah found out later that night. She came at me, accusing me of ruining her life, calling me heartless. I let her yell, let her throw whatever blame she could come up with, and then I looked at her, calm as ever, and said, "You did this to yourself. Don't come crying to me because you can't handle the consequences." She slumped, her anger deflating, replaced by something like regret. But it was too little, too late. I wasn't here to comfort her, wasn't here to pick up the pieces of her broken decisions. She tried to beg, tried to tell me that she'd made a mistake, that we could work through it, but I didn't care. I didn't want to hear it. She'd thrown away our life together for a man who'd be just as shattered as she was now. For weeks, I kept my distance, living like a ghost in the house. I was there for the kids, for the routines, but she was just a stranger to me. She could cry, she could apologize, but I'd given up listening. I knew what I had to do, and every day, I moved a little closer to making it happen. The divorce papers came through, and I made sure she knew every detail. I wasn't giving her any more than she was legally entitled to. Our house, our savings, everything was split with precision, with nothing extra. If she wanted to start over, she'd do it on her own. She'd feel the sting of what she'd thrown away. She tried to talk me out of it, of course. Pleaded with me to think about the kids, about everything we'd built together. But I saw through it. She was scared, desperate, realizing that the fantasy she'd built with Josh had cost her everything. I told her it was done, that there was nothing left to say, and watched her crumble as she finally understood that she'd lost me for good. I moved out 2 weeks later. I left her with the house, left her to explain to the kids why their lives were splitting apart. She'd built this mess, and now she could live with it. I'd lost too much already, but I wasn't going to lose my self-respect. When I closed that door behind me, I felt free. The rage, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all still there, buried deep. But I'd done what I needed to. She could live with her choices, and I'd live with mine. The first month living apart from Sarah was rough. The kids didn't fully understand what was happening, though they knew something was wrong. I didn't give them all the details, I wouldn't use them as pawns in this mess. All they knew was that Mom and Dad were splitting up, that Dad was living somewhere else, and that things would be different from now on. But I could see the questions in their eyes every time I picked them up, every time I dropped them off at Sarah's. They wanted answers, and I could tell Sarah hadn't given them any real explanation either. One night, I was at my new apartment when my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. She wanted to talk face to face, just the two of us. She'd asked a few times since I'd moved out, but I'd ignored every attempt. What was there to talk about? I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. But maybe it was time. The loose ends were getting tangled, the kids were confused, family and friends were starting to ask questions, and I wanted to settle things once and for all. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a park that we used to bring the kids to. It was empty at that hour, the playground silent, the swings still. She was already sitting on one of the benches when I arrived, her arms crossed, looking down at the ground. She glanced up when she saw me and gave a sad, tired smile, but I didn't return it. I was here to close the book, not to give her comfort. I sat down on the other end of the bench, keeping a safe distance between us. She cleared her throat, took a shaky breath, and finally looked at me, her eyes red and tired. "Thank you for coming, Jake," she started, her voice soft. I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say. But I need to say it anyway." I nodded, more to myself than to her. "Go ahead, then." She stared at her hands, twisting her fingers, struggling to find the words. "I've had a lot of time to think. About what I did, about what I ruined. And I don't know how to put it into words, but I'm so sorry, Jake. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." Her words fell flat. I'd heard enough apologies from her to last a lifetime, and by now, they didn't mean anything to me. "You're sorry. Great. Is that all?" She flinched at the coldness in my tone, but I didn't regret it. She destroyed something sacred, and there was no easy way around that. She looked back down at her hands, nodding slowly. "I don't know what else to say. I've tried to make sense of it, but all I can come back to is that I made a terrible, selfish mistake. I didn't bother to hold back." "A mistake?" "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing your temper. What you did wasn't a mistake, Sarah. You made a choice. You chose to cheat. You chose to sneak around with him. And now you want to act like it was just some slip-up?" She swallowed, looking devastated, but I pushed on. "You know, I've spent a lot of nights trying to understand how you could do this. I trusted you. I built my life with you. And you threw it all away for what? For some fling with the neighbor?" Tears slid down her cheeks, but I wasn't finished. "You know what hurts the most? It's not even the betrayal. It's that you thought so little of me, of our family, that you'd risk everything. Did you think about the kids at all? Did you think about what this would do to them?" She choked back a sob, shaking her head. I know I was wrong. I think about it every day, and I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. I don't know how to move on from this." I let her words hang in the air. It was clear that she was broken, that whatever fantasy she'd built with Josh had crumbled as soon as reality hit. But that wasn't my concern anymore. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. I wasn't here to save her. "Look, Sarah," I said finally, my voice as steady as I could make it. "I didn't come here to make you feel better or to give you closure. I came here because we have kids, and they deserve parents who can figure out how to handle this like adults. That's all." She nodded, looking crushed. "I understand. We need to talk to them, together," I continued, keeping my tone calm and detached. "They need to know that none of this is their fault. They need to know what's happening, and they need to hear it from both of us." She nodded again, wiping her tears away. "You're right. They deserve that. For a few moments, we sat in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think there's any chance we could ever get back to where we were?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the desperation in her eyes. She wanted to believe that there was some way back, some chance that we could pretend this hadn't happened. But I was done pretending. "No," I said, my voice firm. "There's no going back, Sarah. You killed any chance of that the moment you decided I wasn't enough. I'll be there for the kids, and I'll keep things civil for their sake. But us? We're done." She closed her eyes, like the finality of it hit her all over again, and nodded. I understand. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, Jake." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Loving me? If that's what you call love, then I'm glad it's over. Because I don't want that kind of love." I stood up, ready to end this, ready to put it all behind me. "We'll figure out a way to tell the kids together. After that, we'll deal with the rest. I'll do my part as their father. But don't expect anything from me beyond that." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with regret. But I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt nothing. "Goodbye, Sarah," I said, turning to leave. "Goodbye, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was it. This was the end. She was just someone I used to know, someone I'd once loved but who no longer had a place in my life. She was a stranger, a person who had burned every bridge between us, and I had no reason to look back. In that moment, I made peace with what she'd done. I didn't forgive her, and I didn't need to. I'd given her everything, and she'd taken it for granted. But that was her burden to carry, not mine. My only focus now was on moving forward, on building a life that was mine and mine alone, free of the lies and the betrayal. The day came to sit down with the kids, and Sarah and I had planned every detail. We met at the house, in the living room where we'd spent countless family nights together, laughing, playing games, telling bedtime stories. But this time, we were sitting on opposite sides of the couch, and the kids could sense the tension right away. They came in quietly, glancing between us with confusion and a hint of worry. They were still young, but they weren't oblivious. They'd heard the conversations cut short when they entered the room, the hushed arguments behind closed doors, the too calm voices we'd both tried to use to hide the truth. Kids pick up on things, and ours were no different. I looked at Sarah and nodded, letting her know I'd start. I didn't want her painting any more fake pictures, pretending that things were complicated or some nonsense that would only leave them confused. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I looked into their wide eyes, faces I'd protect with everything I had. "So, guys, we're here because there's something important we need to talk about," I began, choosing each word carefully. "Your mom and I, we love you very much. That's never going to change. You're the most important people in our lives, and you always will be. But there are some changes that are going to happen, things that might be hard to understand." They looked at each other, then back at us, still confused, waiting for the details. "Mom and I, we're going to live in separate places from now on," I said, watching their faces fall as the reality hit them. "That doesn't mean we don't love you. You'll still see both of us, and we're still a family. But we're just going to be in different houses now." My daughter was the first to speak, her voice shaky. "Why? Why can't you live together?" I paused, feeling the weight of her question. "Sometimes, adults make mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes are too big to fix, even if we want to. This is something between your mom and me, and it doesn't change how much we love you." Sarah jumped in then, tears in her eyes. "Your dad is right. This isn't your fault. You haven't done anything wrong. We both love you, and we'll always be there for you, no matter what." They both nodded, but the look in their eyes told me they didn't fully understand. How could they? How could anyone understand why people who had built a life together, who'd promised to stand by each other, could just stop? Afterward, I hugged them both, reassured them, tried to be the solid presence they needed. Sarah did the same, though I could see how it weighed on her, seeing the pain she'd brought into their lives. But the time for blame was over. My job now was to help my kids move forward, to help them adjust to the new reality, and to make sure they had a steady foundation, even if it was split between two homes. When the conversation was over, we let them go back to their rooms, giving them the space to process. Sarah and I stood there in silence, knowing that the hardest part was behind us, but also knowing it would take time for them to heal. Once the kids were out of earshot, she turned to me, her face pale and drawn. "Thank you for being there, Jake. For keeping it together." I nodded, not feeling the need to say anything more. There was nothing left to discuss. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. This was just the fallout, the part we'd have to live with. In the days that followed, I threw myself into building a new life, creating a space for myself that was free from the ghosts of what had happened. I kept the essentials, my clothes, my work stuff, a few pieces of furniture. I left the house to Sarah, partly for the kids' sake, partly because I needed to detach from the memories, to start over somewhere fresh. My apartment was small, simple, and empty at first. Just a bed, a couch, and a couple of chairs. I didn't bring any of the old photos, none of the souvenirs from our life together. I wanted a clean slate, a place where I could reclaim myself without the weight of the past hanging over me. The first few weeks alone were quiet, almost surreal. The emptiness felt strange, but it was also freeing. I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to play the part of a husband who trusted his wife, didn't have to be the man holding his family together while everything crumbled around him. It was just me, and for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace. One night, I sat down and went through all the evidence I'd gathered, photos, messages, that video clip I'd taken. I looked at each piece, remembering the pain of discovery, the betrayal that had torn my life apart. And then, one by one, I deleted them. I didn't need reminders of what she'd done. I didn't need to carry that weight with me anymore. I'd done what I needed to, I'd faced the truth, confronted her, taken control. Now it was time to let go. As the weeks turned into months, I found new routines, new ways to fill my time. I took up running, spent more time with the kids whenever I could, even started picking up new projects at work. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, like the person I'd been before Sarah's betrayal had cracked everything apart. My friends, the ones who knew what had happened, rallied around me. They took me out, dragged me to games and dinners, reminded me that there was life beyond the wreckage of my marriage. And though it took time, I began to see it too. I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was something waiting for me on the other side of all this pain. Sarah and I kept things civil, mostly for the kids. We coordinated schedules, made sure they never felt like they were being shuttled between two warring camps. I focused on being there for them, showing up at their games, their school events, being the steady presence they needed. If they ever asked questions about why we'd split, I kept my answers simple, respectful. They didn't need the full story. All they needed to know was that both of their parents loved them, that they were still part of a family, even if it looked different now. One evening, several months later, Sarah reached out. She wanted to meet, to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop, a neutral place where there were no memories, no history to haunt us. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She started with the usual pleasantries, the small talk, but I didn't have patience for it. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, my voice calm. She looked down at her coffee, then back up at me, her face serious. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For how you've handled all this. For being there for the kids, for keeping things civil." I shrugged, not really interested in her gratitude. "I did what I had to do." She nodded, looking as if she understood. "I know I can't take back what I did. I can't fix the damage I caused. But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. For the kids, for myself. I want you to know that." I looked at her, seeing the regret in her eyes, the realization of what she'd lost. But it didn't change anything for me. I'd made peace with my choice, with the path I was on, and her words were just that, words. "Good for you, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. I hope you do figure things out. But I'm moving forward, and that doesn't include you. She looked down, nodding. I understand. When I left the coffee shop that night, I felt lighter, like I'd finally shed the last piece of the past. I didn't hate her. I didn't pity her. I felt nothing. And that was all I needed. In the end, I realized that I'd been given a second chance, not one I'd asked for, not one I'd wanted, but one I could shape into something meaningful. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready for it. My life was my own now, free of lies, free of betrayal, free of the weight I'd carried for too long. And as I walked away from the coffee shop, I knew one thing for sure: I was going to make the most of it.